שלום לכם. בישראל מדיניות מדע לא עומדת בראש מעייניהם של מקבלי ההחלטות. למעשה, לרוב אנחנו לא יודעים את עמדתם של נבחרי הציבור שלנו בנושאי מדע, ואפילו לא יודעים אם יש להם עמדה כזו בכלל. שריל קירשנבאום היא המנכ"לית של עמותת Science Debate, שפועלת לקידום מדיניות המדע והטכנולוגיה בארצות הברית, ופועלת כדי שנדע מה נבחרי ציבור חושבים על נושאי מדע וטכנולוגיה. וכדי שנוכל לשוחח, אעבור עכשיו לאנגלית. Shalom and welcome to Cheryl Kirschenbaum, scientist, author, and executive director of the non-profit, non-partisan organization Science Debate. Hello, Cheryl.
Shalom. Thank you so much for having me again.
Why is it important to know what our elected leaders think about science policy? These are not the reasons why we do or do not vote for them.
It's a great question. And it hasn't been the reason that we traditionally vote for them, but I believe that's changing. And that's because, so when I worked in Congress, science issues were considered in this box of other. I came in as a science fellow, so I had been trained as a scientist. This was almost 20 years ago. And I came in with an ocean science background. I was a marine biologist, and I thought I was there to do ocean things. And they gave me everything that sounded remotely science-y. So it might have been animal welfare or energy security, but I realized I was one of the only science people in the office. And what we are trying to do with Science Debate, and Science Debate and other groups have, I think, made a strong case for it, is that science issues aren't separate. So if we're talking about climate change, we're talking about social issues, we're talking about our health, we're talking about things that don't always neatly fall into the box of science, but are going to affect not just our nation, but our entire planet, people all around the world, between Israel and the United States and everywhere else. And so we make the case that we should be thinking about these issues. And when we get pushback and people say, well, I'm not a scientist, because that's very popular among politicians here in the US, we say, well, you're not an economist and you are talking about the economy. You're not trained in security, but you're talking about protecting our nation. And so just because you don't have training in science doesn't mean you shouldn't be prepared to address 21st century challenges.
I understand what you're saying, yeah. Do most elected officials have an interest and understanding of science that helps them form an informed agenda? Or are they completely relied on their advisors saying, I'm not a scientist, my advisor is also not a scientist, but he will deal with this?
So it really, really varies. I can say that here in the United States, very few people with a science background go into politics. Some do. Often those people are medical doctors. But it varies. Some senators and Congress people make it a very important part of their team that they include people with scientific expertise. Some people don't have anyone in their entire office on staff who has a science background. So there are just so many members with so many different priorities that it really varies. But what's been interesting to follow is, since our team got started with Science Debate in 2007, and before that when I worked in Congress, many of these science-related issues weren't even coming up on the radar of these candidates and these politicians. Whereas now, I think we see with a number of science-related issues, they have to talk about them leading up to the election. And just as an example, leading up to the 2008 election, when our team got started with Science Debate, the candidates in the US were Barack Obama and John McCain. Neither of them even mentioned climate change on the campaign trail. I think it was seen as something that could get you in trouble and not something that could win you many voters, where what we saw just recently with the 2020 election, that issue is something that neither candidate, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, could ignore because voters were asking for information. And that's something that citizens in this country have really been banging the drum on. And that's just one of so many issues. A lot of people kind of hear science and they think we only mean climate change, and that's also certainly not the case. So across the board, I feel like, at least here, these issues are really becoming more and more important in our elections.
No, that's really interesting. So sometimes officials are engaging with these issues just because the audience, because of the voters ask them to, but sometimes you need to actively engage them in order for them to care about science policy. How do you do that?
Well, and I think there's also something to be said for motivated reasoning and confirmation bias. And what that is, from the communication science perspective, is we often seek out the science, I guess, the science that we find opinions that we agree with because they suit our other priorities and agendas. And I think that scientists and others haven't really found a great means to work against that. So we see a lot of cherry picking of scientific information where politicians are pointing to data that already supports what they wanted to say. I believe we have a long way to go to work on that. But I think that we also put a lot of the focus on the elected leaders themselves, which is important. But many of these decisions are made before or mostly made at the level of congressional staffer. So one thing I'm very interested in is how those congressional staffers are motivated to make the science policy decisions that they do. And I'm not sure if I actually answered your question because I got really excited to talk about motivated reasoning. But these are the things I think about a lot.
So motivated reasoning really talks in a way about the goals of the officials and their advisors, but what about your goals? What is effective science communication from your point of view?
Toward policymakers? Well, I think having coming from a place that doesn't have an agenda is key. Something that we tried very hard to do with Science Debate is we end up working with a lot of the organizations focused on science across the United States. So that might be the National Academies of Science, that might be the American Association for the Advancement of Science. But we bring all of these groups together and we talk about what the big questions should be. But we make sure we're trying to get at the substance of what policies would look like more than lead candidates into answering a certain way or suggesting that they should prioritize something specifically. I think when you come from a place as an organization or as an individual with that sense that you're listening, that you just want to hear where they are, but you're not kind of pushing a special interest, politicians and others are a lot more willing to engage, to speak with you, to be on record. And sometimes we get responses that are not grounded in science, but our role isn't to weigh in on what's right and what's wrong. We serve as a means for voters to have more information when they participate in democracy.
Interesting. It reminds me this idea that there's no bad publicity. So it's what's important is in a way the awareness, but not actually the specific content that is being said.
Well, I will say we have a lot of media partners. So while on record Science Debate doesn't say, this person's talking about something that's completely unfounded, many of our partners in the media, whether it's the magazine Scientific American or one of the science journals, they'll often weigh in and say, hold on a second, this didn't make any sense and here's why. And we think that kind of discussion after the responses are out there from our candidates are really, those are really important discussions to have. We just also know that it would be it wouldn't serve our purpose of getting them to talk about science if they feel like they're taking a quiz, if they feel like they're being judged by the organization asking the questions.
Of course. So to take a different angle, what do you recommend to scientists who wish to impact policy with their research? How should they approach policymakers or their advisors? What should they do?
Well, I love the question because that implies that they want to engage, and we're seeing more and more people in science have those desires than we ever did before. Back when I was in grad school about 20 years ago, some of the people in my cohort said, I remember one of our big final presentations was to talk about our research, and somebody went to the chair and complained. She said, I went into science so I wouldn't have to talk about what I do. And I think that there's much more a sense today, especially of earlier career scientists and faculty, that they want to describe why their research matters and why science matters in influencing policy. And as we've seen in these global mobilizations of young scientists and young citizens, the March for Science is just one example. I think we're seeing less of kind of that old-fashioned view, more people feeling like this matters and how do I get engaged? Now, to answer your question, there's many things we can do on a personal level. Something that I do, because I move a lot, I'm on my 9th state in the US. Every time I move, I get to know my local representatives. I get to know personally the people in office because I might not be an expert in the type of issue they're working on, but I've built a relationship. So if they have questions, they often come to me and say, well, who do you know that works
Mm.
on wind turbines, or I need someone to talk to me about energy or food or whatever it is. So even if I'm not that person, we've built a relationship, and they often come to me and trust where I send them next.
Mhm.
I think for people in entering this space who maybe aren't so sure where to start, there are a lot of organizations that already do exist that have been thinking about these kinds of things for a long time. I can't say I'm very familiar with what is in Israel, but I think that there are global organizations, or organizations that have worked internationally, I should say, whether it's the national academies or the national academies doesn't do a lot in the science policy space. They're getting more into that, but there's a group called the Union of Concerned Scientists. Our organization has helped, I think, 8 other nations host science conversations before elections. In the US, we have a group, the Center for American Progress. But there are a lot of groups that are already there, that have already organized. Those are a good place to look and to start as you kind of get your feet wet and start to learn about how these conversations take place. But I think it's so important that all of us engage in whatever way is comfortable. And that might just be sending an email, that might be showing up at a member's office to say, hello, here's what matters to me. But all of these things matter. And I can say that firsthand, having worked in one of these offices, our voices really do matter. Whether it's because candidates feel that, or elected officials feel that they continue to need our votes. They want to prioritize the things that are important to their constituents, or whether it's just more broadly because you feel like you want to engage. My experience, at least, suggests that members and their staff do want to hear from constituents, from the citizens of their country or state or even local community. Oh, and that would be the other thing. I think getting involved locally matters so much. It's easy to look at the media and think only about national politics or international relationships, when what happens locally in our own communities usually affects us more, whether it's about clean water or access to food or any number of issues. So I always do encourage people to think about getting involved at the local level as an advisor, or even running for office themselves, because the more people with expertise in those positions will get us probably to a more informed place in terms of the legislative process. So,
Cheryl Kirschenbaum, thank you so much for talking with us today about these important issues.
thank you.